The morning fog hung thick over the Normandy countryside as Lieutenant James Morrison crouched behind a hedgerow, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped his binoculars. Through the haze, he could make out the unmistakable silhouette moving slowly down the dirt road. That angular turret, those massive tracks that seemed to crush everything in their path. His throat went dry. A Tiger tank. Morrison had heard the stories from veterans who'd faced them in North Africa and Italy. 88mm gun that could punch through American armor from over a mile away. Frontal armor so thick that standard anti-tank rounds just bounced off like pebbles against a castle wall. The Sherman tanks his platoon commanded looked like children's toys in comparison. He'd lost 2 crews already that week. Good men, friends. Their Shermans had been reduced to burning coffins in seconds. Now here he was again, face to face with the beast that haunted every American tanker's nightmares. Morrison lowered his binoculars and glanced at his crew. Tommy Chen, the gunner, looked back at him with wide eyes. The kid was barely 21. Behind them, 3 more Shermans waited in concealed positions. Standard American tactics use numbers, speed, and coordination to overwhelm superior German armor. But knowing the theory and executing it while staring down that massive gun barrel were 2 very different things. The Tiger's engine rumbled closer. Morrison's hand moved to his radio transmitter. This is how you fight a monster with a penknife, he thought. You don't face it head-on, you get creative. The story of how American tank crews learned to defeat the Tiger tank isn't really about the machines at all. It's about the men who climbed into inferior vehicles day after day, knowing they were outgunned and out-armored, yet somehow found ways to survive and win. It's about innovation born from desperation, tactics developed through bitter experience, and courage that bordered on madness. The Tiger tank represented everything the German military-industrial complex could achieve at its peak. When it first appeared on the Eastern Front in late 1942, it was essentially invincible. Soviet tankers watched in horror as their shells bounced harmlessly off its armor, while the Tiger's gun obliterated their T-34s from ranges they couldn't even return fire from. By the time Tigers started appearing in North Africa in early 1943, their reputation had already spread throughout the Allied forces like a virus of fear. The numbers told a brutal story. A Tiger weighed 56 tons compared to the Sherman's 33. Its frontal armor measured 100mm thick in places. The Sherman's frontal armor maxed out at 76mm, and that was only on later models. Most Shermans in Normandy still had the original 51mm frontal armor. The Tiger's 88mm gun could penetrate a Sherman's armor from over 2,000 yards. The Sherman's 75mm gun, at best, could only penetrate a Tiger's side armor from about 500 yards. And that's assuming a perfect 90-degree hit. Anything less than perpendicular, and the shell would just glance off. These weren't just statistics. They translated directly into life and death. A Tiger could sit at the end of a Norman lane, completely protected by those famous hedgerows, and pick off American tanks one by one as they tried to advance. The Shermans would have to close to suicidal ranges just to have a chance of causing damage. First Lieutenant Clarence Smoyer knew these odds intimately. He commanded a Sherman in the 3rd Armored Division Spearhead Unit, one of the most battle-hardened formations in the entire European theatre. By March 1945, Smoyer had already survived months of combat from Normandy to the German border. He'd seen friends die. He'd watched Sherman after Sherman brew up, as the tankers grimly called it, the ammunition cooking off inside in massive fireballs that gave crews seconds at best to escape. The survival rate for a Sherman crew whose tank was penetrated was roughly 20%. For perspective, American bomber crews over Europe had better odds. Smoyer was quiet, methodical, thoughtful, not the stereotypical aggressive tanker. But he was still alive when so many weren't, and that counted for something. His crew trusted him completely. They'd learned to read his calm voice over the intercom, knowing that his steadiness under fire had saved their lives more than once. The spring morning in Cologne started like any other advance into a German city. Smoyer's Sherman, nicknamed Eagle 7, rumbled through the rubble-strewn streets as part of a column pushing toward the cathedral district. The massive Gothic spires of Cologne Cathedral loomed in the distance, somehow still standing amid the devastation. Intelligence had reported that German resistance in this sector was collapsing. Most enemy forces had withdrawn across the Rhine. The column moved with cautious confidence, tank commanders standing in their open hatches, scanning the ruins for any remaining pockets of resistance.
That's when everything went wrong.
The lead Sherman, about 60 yards ahead of Smoyer's position, suddenly erupted in a geyser of flame and metal. The explosion was so violent that the turret cartwheeled through the air before crashing into a bombed-out building. No one in that crew survived. Before anyone could react, the second tank in line took a hit. Then the third. Smoyer's training took over. His mind raced through possibilities, even as his body was already acting.
That rate of fire.
That penetrating power. The way those Shermans just disintegrated.
Only one thing could do that. Tiger. Smoyer's driver immediately reversed their Sherman behind a pile of rubble without waiting for orders.
The crew had drilled this 1,000 times.
Get off the X. Never stay where the enemy last saw you.
Disappear and reposition. Through his periscope, Smoyer frantically scanned the street ahead, looking for the source of those devastating shots. There. In the shadows beside a half-collapsed building, almost completely concealed by debris, sat a Panther tank. Wait, no. As his eyes adjusted, he realized his mistake. The silhouette was wrong. Too angular?
Too massive. Tiger. And it was expertly positioned, hull down behind rubble, with only its turret exposed, commanding the entire boulevard.
The German crew had set up a perfect ambush. Any American tank trying to advance down that street would be a sitting duck. Smoyer's mind raced. His Sherman's gun couldn't penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor, even at point-blank range, and they were at least 200 yards away. Going forward was suicide, but retreating would leave the entire column stalled, exposed, vulnerable. There had to be another way. This is where American tactical innovation had evolved by 1945. The early days of simply accepting horrific loss ratios were over. Commanders like Smoyer had learned hard lessons through brutal experience. Tigers might be superior machines, but they had weaknesses. They were mechanically unreliable. They were slow. They were rare, meaning German crews couldn't afford to lose them. And most importantly, they had thinner armor on the sides and rear. American doctrine had evolved. You don't fight a Tiger head-on if you can possibly avoid it. You maneuver. You flank. You coordinate. Smoyer got on the radio to his platoon leader, quickly sketching out a plan. While one Sherman kept the Tiger's attention with shots that would bounce harmlessly off its frontal armor, Smoyer would work his way through the rubble to the left, using destroyed buildings as cover. If he could get to the Tiger's flank, even his 75mm gun would have a chance. It was insanely risky. If the Tiger's crew spotted him maneuvering, they'd traverse that massive turret, and Eagle 7 would become another burning hulk. But doing nothing guaranteed the same result, just slower. The next 5 minutes felt like 5 hours. Smoyer's Sherman carefully picked its way through collapsed buildings, grinding over piles of brick and timber, the crew barely breathing as they tried to keep engine noise to a minimum. Through gaps in the rubble, Smoyer could glimpse the Tiger, still focused on the boulevard where the rest of his platoon was keeping it occupied with harassing fire. The German crew was disciplined. They weren't wasting ammunition on impossible shots. They were conserving rounds, waiting patiently for American tanks to expose themselves. Classic Tiger tactics. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of cautious movement, Smoyer's Sherman emerged from behind a shattered apartment building with a clear line of sight to the Tiger's right side. The angle wasn't perfect, maybe 60 degrees off perpendicular, but it was the best he was going to get. Smoyer's hands were steady as he gave the order. Gunner, armor-piercing, Tiger, right side.
700 yards.
The response came immediately. Identified. His gunner, Bob Early, was one of the best in the division. If anyone could make this shot count, it was Early. The Sherman's gun roared. Through his periscope, Smoyer watched the tracer arc across the ruined cityscape and slam into the Tiger's side armor.
Sparks flew.
For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then smoke began pouring from the German tank's engine deck. They'd penetrated. The Tiger's crew reacted with professional speed, trying to traverse their turret toward this new threat, but smoke was now billowing from multiple hatches. Fire. The crew began bailing out, climbing desperately from their stricken vehicle as flames consumed their invincible fortress. Smoyer's crew erupted in cheers over the intercom, the tension of the last hour releasing in a wave of relief and triumph. But Smoyer himself stayed calm, already scanning for other threats. One Tiger down didn't mean the street was clear. This was Germany in 1945. Desperate last stands happened around every corner. The Cologne engagement became somewhat famous, later captured on film by an army cameraman who happened to be embedded with the column. But it represented just one example of tactics that American tank crews had been developing and refining since first encountering Tigers in Tunisia back in 1943. Those early encounters had been disasters. American tank doctrine before facing Tigers had assumed rough parity between opposing armor. The idea that an enemy tank could simply be invulnerable from the front hadn't really entered planning. When M4 Shermans first faced Tigers in North Africa, entire platoons were wiped out in minutes, their crews never even understanding what had hit them. Survivors brought back terrifying reports. Tanks destroyed from ranges American gunners thought were completely safe. Armor-piercing rounds that bounced off German frontal armor like rubber balls. A weapon system that seemed to render American armor obsolete. The psychological impact was devastating. Tank crews began calling Shermans Ronsons after the cigarette lighter company whose slogan was "Lights, first time, every time." Grim humor masking genuine terror. Some crews started putting sandbags on their Sherman's hulls, desperate for any additional protection, even though the added weight was minimal. Others welded extra track links to their frontal armor. None of it really helped against an 88mm round, but it gave men something to do, some illusion of control over their fate. The British faced the same problem and often had an even more fatalistic attitude about it. Their Churchill and Cromwell tanks were no better matched against Tigers than American Shermans. British tankers developed their own gallows humor, referring to their tactics against Tigers as brewing up Jerry, while knowing full well they'd be the ones brewing up most of the time. What changed wasn't the hardware. America continued using the Sherman throughout the war, despite its limitations. What changed was how those Shermans were employed. By mid-1944, tactical doctrine had evolved dramatically. First principle, never face a Tiger alone. Always attack with multiple tanks from multiple directions. Force the German crew to make choices about where to point that fearsome gun. While they're killing one Sherman, others maneuver for flank shots. It was brutal arithmetic. American commanders accepted that they'd likely lose 2 or 3 Shermans to destroy one Tiger. But Tigers were rare. Germany produced only about 1,300 Tigers during the entire war. America built nearly 50,000 Shermans. The exchange ratio favored America even when individual engagements seemed disastrous. Second principle, use terrain. Tigers were heavy and mechanically unreliable. Their weight meant they couldn't cross many bridges that lighter Shermans could use. Their tendency to break down meant German crews were often reluctant to take them into difficult terrain where recovery would be impossible if something went wrong. American commanders learned to channel Tiger attacks into killing zones where that mobility disadvantage mattered. Force them into close terrain where their range advantage disappeared. Get them into towns where shots were measured in yards, not miles. Third principle, coordinate with other weapons. A Sherman might not be able to kill a Tiger head-on, but a P-47 Thunderbolt loaded with 5-inch rockets could. American commanders learned to call in air support the moment Tigers appeared, or bring up tank destroyers, vehicles with heavier guns specifically designed for long-range dueling, or coordinate with infantry carrying bazookas who could sneak close enough to hit vulnerable points. Staff Sergeant Lafayette Poole became a legend in the 3rd Armored Division by mastering these principles. Poole was a quiet Texan who'd been working in a general store before the war. Nothing about his background suggested he'd become one of the most effective tank killers in the European theater. But Poole had an almost supernatural ability to read terrain and anticipate enemy positions. He treated tank combat like chess, always thinking 3 moves ahead. Poole's crew destroyed over 250 enemy vehicles during their combat tour, including multiple Tigers and Panthers. His tactics were methodical. Never charge in. Always scout. Always have an escape route planned before engaging. Use your Sherman's mechanical reliability and decent speed to your advantage.
Keep moving. Never be where the enemy expects.
When facing superior armor, make it a movement problem, not a gunfight. Poole's luck ran out in September 1944 when his Sherman hit a mine near the German border. He survived but lost a leg.
His war was over.
But the tactics he'd pioneered lived on, passed from crew to crew through hard-won experience. The American Army's strength was never in having the best individual equipment. It was in having the best logistics, the best communications, the best ability to learn and adapt. German crews might start the war better trained and better equipped. But as the war dragged on, their quality declined while America's improved. By 1945, the average American tank crew had more combat experience than their German counterparts. They'd learned from mistakes that had killed their predecessors. They'd developed instincts that helped them survive encounters with superior armor. The Tiger crews themselves were aware of this shift. Captured German tankers spoke with respect, sometimes frustration, about how American tactics had evolved. Early in the war, they said, American tanks would obligingly line up and get destroyed one by one. By late 1944, Americans fought smart. They coordinated. They used combined arms. They exploited every weakness. One captured Tiger commander complained bitterly that he'd been surrounded by 7 Shermans in a French village. Every time he'd turn to engage one, another would hit him from a different angle. He'd destroyed 3 before a shot penetrated his rear armor and disabled his tank. He was angry not at losing, but at the realization that his technological superiority hadn't mattered. The Americans had simply changed the terms of engagement. Technical improvements helped too, though they came slower than Sherman crews wanted. By late 1944, the M4A3E8 Sherman variant appeared, featuring better suspension, a more powerful engine, and most importantly, a new 76mm high-velocity gun. This gun still couldn't reliably penetrate a Tiger's frontal armor, but it had a much better chance against side armor at practical combat ranges. More importantly, it gave American crews confidence. The psychological impact of having a gun that at least felt more capable shouldn't be underestimated. Tank combat is as much about crew morale as ballistics. The British also fielded the Sherman Firefly, mounting a British 17-pounder gun in a modified Sherman chassis. This weapon could actually penetrate Tiger frontal armor at reasonable ranges. Standard British tactics became to include 1 Firefly in every troop of Shermans. The Firefly's job was specifically to kill. German heavy armor, while regular Shermans handled everything else. American forces got limited numbers of M26, Pershing heavy tanks in the final months of the war. With 90mm guns and heavy armor, Pershings could trade shots with Tigers on roughly equal terms. But they arrived too late and in too few numbers to really matter strategically. The war in Europe was won with Shermans, not Pershings. The real American heavy weapons were M36 tank destroyers, vehicles that sacrificed armor for a powerful 90mm gun. Tank destroyers weren't supposed to fight other tanks directly, despite the name. Their doctrine was to sit in ambush positions and knock out enemy armor from long range before disappearing. In practice, they often got drawn into direct tank battles, simply because Tigers were such priority targets that every available weapon got thrown at them. The crew of Colorado, an M-36 tank destroyer in the 776th Tank Destroyer Battalion, became experts at this kind of fighting. They'd set up in defensive positions, often hull down behind terrain features, and wait. When Tigers or Panthers appeared, they'd fire from concealment, then immediately displace to alternate positions before German artillery could respond.
Hit and run.
Never stay in one place. Their commander, Lieutenant Paul Bauer, kept a notebook of every engagement, analyzing what worked and what didn't. His notes read like a survival manual. Never fire more than 2 shots from same position. Tiger crews are trained to return accurate fire immediately. Always have routes scouted for fast withdrawal. Our armor won't stop return fire. Aim for drive sprockets or engine deck if possible. Mobility kills are as good as destruction. Infantry played crucial roles in defeating Tigers too, though their contributions often went unrecognized. Bazookas couldn't penetrate Tiger frontal armor, but they could damage tracks, periscopes, and external equipment. A Tiger with damaged tracks was essentially immobilized, transforming from apex predator to sitting duck. American infantry developed tactics of infiltrating close to Tiger positions under cover of darkness or smoke, then systematically disabling them with bazooka shots to vulnerable points. Wasn't glamorous work. It required enormous courage to get close enough to a Tiger to attempt it. German infantry always screened their heavy armor precisely to prevent this kind of attack. But when it worked, the results justified the risk. A single immobilized Tiger often had to be abandoned by its crew when American forces advanced, denying Germany a vehicle they could barely afford to lose. The Germans knew their Tigers were vulnerable to these tactics but had limited options to counter them. They tried to always use Tigers in groups, mutual support, preventing isolated tanks from being swarmed. They tried to keep Tigers in positions where American forces couldn't flank them easily. They tried to screen them with infantry and lighter vehicles. But by 1944, Germany was losing the broader war. Fuel shortages meant Tigers often couldn't maneuver as doctrine required. Personnel losses meant supporting infantry wasn't always available. And American air superiority meant that any Tiger spotted in the open was likely to get attacked from above before it could even engage ground targets. The famous Panther tank, which appeared in even larger numbers than the Tiger, presented similar problems to American crews. Panthers had sloped armor that was incredibly effective and a powerful 75mm gun. In many ways, Panthers were actually more dangerous than Tigers because they were more numerous, more reliable, and nearly as deadly. But the same tactical principles applied. Don't fight fair, maneuver, coordinate, use combined arms, accept losses to achieve objectives. By the war's end, American tank crews had developed an almost casual competence in dealing with German heavy armor. Not because the hardware gap had closed, but because they'd learned to fight asymmetrically. They used their strengths, speed, numbers, coordination and support against German weaknesses, mechanical reliability, logistics, and declining crew quality. The Battle of Aracourt in September 1944 showcased American tactical evolution perfectly. The 4th Armored Division, equipped entirely with standard 75mm Shermans, engaged elements of the German 5th Panzer Army, including numerous Panthers. On paper, this should have been a slaughter of American forces. Instead, the 4th Armored Division destroyed over 200 German armored vehicles while losing only about 25 of their own tanks. How? By using terrain masterfully, employing superior communications to coordinate fires, calling in devastating artillery and air support, and refusing to fight on German terms. When Panthers tried to engage at long range, Americans disappeared into terrain and repositioned. When Germans closed range, Americans ambushed from multiple directions. It was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. Stories of individual crew heroism are countless. Sergeant William McBriar's Sherman took a Panther round through the frontal armor, killing the assistant driver instantly. The interior of the tank was instantly filled with smoke and the screams of wounded men. Instead of bailing out, McBriar stayed on the gun, fired 3 rapid shots at the Panther, got a lucky hit on its ammunition rack, and destroyed it before ordering his crew to evacuate. He pulled 2 wounded crew members from the burning Sherman before it exploded. He received the Silver Star, but said later that he only did what any commander would do, take care of his men. Or Corporal Carlton Chapman, whose Sherman's gun malfunctioned during an engagement with a Tiger. Rather than retreat, Chapman ordered his driver to ram the German tank at full speed. The impact damaged both vehicles, but Chapman's crew was able to bail out and escape, while the shocked Tiger crew was still recovering. The Tiger had to be abandoned when its drivetrain was damaged in the collision. Chapman received a Bronze Star and a reputation for borderline insanity that followed him the rest of his life. These stories highlight something crucial about the American experience fighting Tigers. It wasn't about the machines. It was always about the men. German engineering created fearsome weapons, but weapons don't win wars by themselves. Wars are won by logistics, training, morale, tactical flexibility, and the courage of individual soldiers in impossible situations. By 1945, American forces had all of those advantages, even if they didn't have the best tanks. The production numbers tell the story. Germany produced about 1,300 Tigers and 6,000 Panthers during the entire war. America produced 49,234 Sherman tanks. Even accounting for losses, the material advantage was overwhelming. For every Tiger Germany fielded, America could field 30 or 40 Shermans. The math was brutal, but effective. After the war, there was significant controversy about the Sherman tank. Some critics argued that American tankers had been needlessly sacrificed by being sent into battle with inferior equipment.
Why didn't America produce heavy tanks that could match Tigers?
The answer was complex. Heavy tanks require heavy industry, rare materials, extensive logistics networks, and enormous amounts of fuel. Tigers were maintenance nightmares that broke down constantly. They were too heavy for many bridges. They consumed fuel at rates Germany's collapsing logistics couldn't sustain. From a strategic perspective, Tigers were actually somewhat wasteful. All that engineering excellence, all those resources for a vehicle that spent as much time broken down as fighting. Shermans, by contrast, were reliable. They could be repaired in the field with basic tools. They could use standardized parts. They could run on various fuel types if necessary. They could be transported anywhere American logistics reached. From a total war perspective, the Sherman was arguably the better design, even though individual Tigers were superior combat vehicles. The men who fought in Shermans generally understood this, though they certainly would have appreciated better armor and guns. They knew they were part of a larger system. Lose a Sherman and a replacement would arrive within days. Lose a Tiger, and the German crew might wait weeks or months for a new vehicle if they got one at all. This industrial advantage meant American forces could afford to take risks, try new tactics, learn from failures. German forces had to be more cautious with their limited resources, which actually gave Americans initiative despite hardware disadvantages. The ultimate vindication of American tactics came in the casualty figures. Yes, America lost more tanks than Germany in most engagements, but America lost fewer crew members per tank destroyed. Sherman crews that bailed out often survived to fight again in a new tank. Tiger crews whose vehicles were destroyed often became casualties because the catastrophic penetrations that destroyed Tigers tended to kill crews instantly. Modern analysis suggests that, accounting for all factors, the Sherman was actually quite effective despite its limitations against heavy German armor. It was cheap to produce, reliable, easy to maintain, and adequate against most threats it faced. Tigers and Panthers represented less than 20% of German armored vehicles. The vast majority of German tanks were Panzerfalls and assault guns that Shermans could engage effectively. Designing America's entire tank force around the rare occasions when they'd faced Tigers would have been strategically foolish. The real lesson wasn't about tanks at all. It was about adaptability. American forces entered the war with inadequate equipment and doctrine. They learned fast. They adapted. They overcame. That flexibility, that ability to learn from failure and rapidly implement lessons learned characterized the American military experience in World War II. Tiger tanks were engineering marvels and terrifying weapons. But they didn't win the war for Germany. They couldn't, because wars aren't won by individual weapon systems, no matter how superior. They're won by nations that can outproduce, outthink, and outfight their enemies across every dimension of conflict. American tank crews who climbed into Shermans knowing they were outgunned and out-armored deserve enormous credit. They faced their fear every day. They developed tactics that saved lives. They trusted their training and their brothers in neighboring tanks. Many died, but they achieved their objectives and helped win the war. The Tiger tank has achieved almost mythical status in popular culture, and it deserves respect as a remarkable weapon. But the men who defeated Tigers in inferior vehicles deserve even more respect. They proved that courage, creativity, and determination can overcome technological superiority. That's a lesson that transcends World War II and remains relevant today.